Hi everyone. This is the third lecture in the series on legal positivism, and it explores how legal positivism spread around the world and how it became the dominant philosophy in many jurisdictions. It's important to start out by saying that legal positivism did not remain an English phenomenon, although that is where it started, but that it spread to other parts of the world. In all cases, the spread had a number of characteristics. In the first place, in all cases, it replaced a version of natural law. And although that version of natural law would be different in various jurisdictions, in all cases, there was some form of natural law thinking prior to legal positivism. But in all cases, it also took on characteristics that were unique to the countries affected. In other words, it is not as if the version of legal positivism that you have in England is exactly the same as the one you have in South Africa. That depends on what happened, what the history was, and how things developed in that specific country. It's also important to remember that it is inextricably tied to colonization. That is why you tend to find legal positivist thinking very strongly associated with countries that were colonized by the British. And you can see that in Africa, for example, the difference between French colonies and English colonies. The English colonies all tend to have a version of the same kind of legal positivism, although, as I said, it will have unique characteristics. And in the last place, it is accompanied by English legal rules and legal institutions, so that certain institutions only work in terms of legal positivism because it's also tied to English law. And that's once again why I say that it is different for French colonies and for English colonies. So just to give two examples, the first one is the exception to the rules that I've just said happened on the European continent. In Europe, you do have examples of legal positivism, but they are not linked to English law, and they are not tied to English institutions, obviously, because English law was not in force in Europe. An example of this would be Hans Kelsen, the German philosopher, legal philosopher. And if you read this, you will see he said it is called a pure theory of law. That's Kelsen's theory, is the pure theory of law, because it only describes the law and attempts to eliminate from the object of this description everything that is not strictly law. Its aim is to free the science of law from alien elements. This is the methodological basis of the theory. And you can see in this definition all the elements that we discussed in the previous two lectures, i.e. the separation of law from morality, the scientific nature of morality, of law, etc., etc., etc. So you do get exceptions where it's not linked to English law, but it's still a form of legal positivism. The other interesting example comes from America. And the American philosophy, right from the start, was also a version of natural law. In American philosophy, they called it republicanism, and it's very strongly community-based and with a strong moral foundation. That all changed due to the influence of a guy by the name of Christopher Columbus Langdell, who was the dean of Harvard Law School. And you can see it in this quote from him, and he says, "Law is a science." There you go. And all the available materials of that science are contained in printed books. The library is the proper workshop of professors and students alike. It is to us all that the laboratories of the university are to the chemists and physicists, the Museum of Natural History to the zoologists, the botanical garden to the botanists. So you can see with the Americans, this is where the change comes in and where we begin to see law as a science. It's interesting that this development will eventually result in a school of thinking that's called American realism. And American realism is currently, I would suggest, the dominant theory in American law. This kind of thinking is also sometimes in America called formalism or even legalism, but it is a typically American phenomenon. Now, if we then move to South Africa, South Africa, we often think of the country as what we know it at the moment, but that is fairly recent in the history of the world. South Africa before 1910 consisted of, on the one hand, indigenous tribal kingdoms or just tribal communities. And you will see this on the left-hand side, that map that I have there, which indicates where the English were, where the Xhosa were, where the Zulus were, etc., etc. It gives an indication of where these groups were concentrated. And then on the right-hand side, you get, excuse me a moment, on the right-hand side is a map of what we call the Boer republics. And the Boer republics were sections of the country that the Afrikaner occupied. And so you see there were 4 or 5 of these republics. They weren't connected. They weren't one country. Orange Free State was a republic. The South Afrikaanse Republiek, which later would be called Transvaal, was a republic. Stellaland was a republic. So you had, before 1910, this incredibly fragmented map of South Africa. There was no such thing as South Africa before 1910. And what is interesting is that in both the case of the kingdoms, the indigenous kingdoms and tribes, as well as the Boer republics, they were all governed by a version of natural law. I would suggest in the case of, for example, the Zulu Empire, it is a form of tribal community based on ancestor worship, based on primogeniture, based on the power of the king. So it is, in that sense, a natural law system. The same is true of the Boer republics, except that in this case, it is all governed by Protestantism, and very specifically Calvinism. So the laws of the country is determined and validated by religion. In the case of the Boer republics, then Calvinism or Protestantism. This all changes in 1910 with the formation of the Union of South Africa under the British, when everyone was, when the whole country was united into one unit, one country, governed by the 1910 Constitution. And just an interesting aside, the flag that is now so associated with the National Party actually comes from the British. And it was part of the 1910 Constitution that was the flag, with the colors and the flags of 2 of the Boer republics as well as Britain in the center of it. But this is the first time that we can start talking about one country from 1910. And in the course of human history, that's a very short time, but never mind. But this is, with the Union of South Africa, we get the biggest influence of English law, English institutions, and then also legal positivism. And it's interesting that it comes from the legal institutions, but it also comes from a very strange source, and that is the academics, specifically Afrikaans academics, who went to study, not in England because we hated the English, but went to study in Germany and in Holland, where they got under the influence of someone like Hans Kelsen, for example. Okay. Now, in South Africa, legal positivism took on the form of what is called parliamentary sovereignty, an idea that is taken from Professor A.V. Dicey, and he defined the term as the right of Parliament to make and unmake any law whatsoever. and further that no person or body is recognized by the law of England as having a right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament. So this implies that the form that legal positivism takes here is one of parliamentary sovereignty, where Parliament makes the laws and courts have no testing capacity and cannot set aside these laws, which of course means that there is a great limit to what courts could actually do during apartheid years. This led to what was called at the time executive mindedness. And this is an article by Judge Cameron, as he now is, who said that this executive mindedness comes as a result of the influence of one of the Afrikaans writers, Steyn. And this is the idea that even if there is something wrong with the law, you don't declare it invalid because you do what the executive wants you to do. And I have argued in that article that I sent to all of you that it is executive mindedness or authoritarianism that is to blame for the bad decisions of apartheid governments and not legal positivism as such. So the question becomes, what is the situation today? I would argue that legal positivism is still the main theory of courts, at least in South Africa, and the courts are still very much executive minded. And we saw this during the lockdown in case law, where even when it seemed very clear to everybody that the laws that were being made were unconstitutional and an overreach of authority, they were not declared invalid and unconstitutional. And I have argued in another setting that this is because our courts are still executive minded. They still think that they should not question the will of government. What do you think?